3 years ago, if you looked up the definition of serial plant killer in the dictionary, I'm almost certain that it would have pulled up a picture of me. Today, I'm really proud to say that I'm the proud plant owner of more than 150 plants. In my previous video, I explained that I stopped counting at 150, but please don't tell my family. It's probably more like over 200 now, so shh, that can be our little secret. But what changed? I'm going to share with you what I've learned over the past 3 years in less than 20 minutes, and I think you're going to be surprised because the first 2 tips that I have nothing to do with the type of plants. So the number one thing that I've learned with plants is not to take failures personally. The biggest game changer for me is putting that scientist hat on and being curious and asking the why and thinking, all right, that plant died, but what happened? What can I learn from that? And what can I do differently next time? The great news that I have for you is there's no such thing as a green thumb. The more that I get involved in the plant community and the more amazing people that I meet, is I've realized often the really experienced people with plants have killed way more plants than I have ever owned. And I have potentially killed way more plants than you have ever owned. We're all just learning. And there's actually some really great resources out there, both online and at local nurseries and in community groups. And I've learned just so much. And don't get me wrong, it's still something I'm working on. It is really hard not to take it personally when you have a plant that's not doing well or you have a plant that dies. Along the same lines, if you get a plant and it's not working in your space, it's okay to give it away to someone or to compost it. You don't have to keep that plant. I often say to people, I don't have time for diva plants. I only have plants that work well in my home because I have 150 plants and it takes a while to look after them. So I don't have time for plants that don't do well in my house. So at least twice a year, I go through my plants and I think, well, what plants aren't making me happy and what plants are making me work a little bit too hard? Or I do plant swaps and I'm more than happy to give them to people or actually just put them up for free on Facebook. Looking after plants should be calming and relaxing. Don't think that you have to struggle through a plant that's not working for you. The second thing that I learned was to get to know your home. Everyone's home is unique. So for example, we have different amounts of light coming through. Some of us might use air conditioning more, some of us might use heating more. We might have curtains, there might be a big tree outside that's blocking the light from coming in. Even my very close neighbour has plants that don't work at her house. And I have plants that don't work at my house but can work really well at her house. So get to know your house. Where does the light come in? It's putting that scientist hat back on again. As the seasons change, so too does the light that's coming into your house. So for example, I'm filming this in winter and I actually get more sun coming into my house in winter than I do in summer. And although the sun is not as intense, there is more direct light coming into our house. So there's a number of plants that I've actually had to move back away from the window because even though the light is not as intense as it is in summer, it still will scorch the leaves. Also in winter, the other change for our house is we do use heating and plants really don't appreciate being in front of heating and cooling units. So whether it's air conditioning in summer or heating in winter, if you are using heating or cooling units and the plants are getting that direct draft, that's going to dry them out really quickly. They're not going to enjoy that. And also airflow, it's really important that plants get airflow and they're not stuck in a dead or a stagnant corner. Number 3, understanding where our houseplants come from. There's 2 main places that our houseplants come from. They're usually either tropical or they're your arid, your succulents and your cactuses. So it's really important when you're getting a plant to think about where the plants originate from in nature and trying to replicate that in your house. So the majority of our houseplants come from tropical areas. So if you think high humidity, rainfall, they like filtered dapple light because they'll be under the canopy of the trees, so direct light is a no. Whereas your succulents and cactuses are used to higher light situations and a drier, less humid, arid environment. If you keep that in mind when you're buying a plant, how can you replicate that in your house? So for example, the windows that I talked about that now have the direct sun coming through, I had a beautiful monstera plant on a shelf in one of our back rooms and it actually ended up getting scorched because it's not a room that I go into every day, and the season had changed and the direct sun started coming into it. It actually ended up with leaf scorch and I had to trim off most of the leaves. I'm happy to say that it is now recovered and I've put it into a much better spot, but that's just a really good example. Monstera definitely are a filtered bright light sort of plant. So just thinking about how they grow in the wild and then trying to replicate that in my home. On the same topic, there's only one place at the moment that I can actually grow succulents and cactus as well. I've got a beautiful big macadamia nut tree in our backyard, and it gets filtered light in the direct sun part of the day. Underneath the tree gets that beautiful morning light, and my succulents and cactus seem to do really well under there. But on the flip side, 3 years ago, I lost count of how many succulents I killed because I thought that they were a great starter plant. I thought plants need water, so I continued to put succulents in our bathroom, our low light bathroom, and watered them 2 or 3 times a week. And the sicker they looked, the more I watered them, and I was wondering why they were dying. And if you go back to where cactuses grow in the wild, that was the last thing that they need. They need nice bright light, some direct light, and they need their soil to dry out in between waterings. No wonder I was killing all of my cactuses, but I didn't know that because I didn't know to check where they grew in the wild. So number 3 has also been massive for me. So let's recap. Number 1, sometimes you can be doing absolutely everything right and plants still die. So don't be too hard on yourself and take it as a learning, and just keep learning, keep trying, keep learning. Number 2 is get to know your home, get to know the conditions in your home so that when you're choosing plants, you already have ideas in your mind of where that plant might work. And number 3, know about the origin of plants before you buy them. Understand where they're going to work in your home, so you don't, like me, go putting cactuses and succulents in your low light, very humid bathrooms. Number 4, try again. Number 4 is my very favorite plant topic, and that is light. And I can't believe, as a scientist, I didn't think back to photosynthesis that I've learned over and over again, both at high school and university. But plants eat light. Plants need light to photosynthesize and produce the sugar that they use to grow. So the sugar is actually the main food source for plants. Fertilizer is also needed, but that just provides them with micronutrients. It's not their main food source. The sugar is from the sun. When people say that there's low light plants or plants that grow in no light, I'm really wary of that. So I do have plants in my home that are growing in low light areas, but I take them outside 3 or 4 times a week to make sure that they're getting that nice bright filtered light. I mean, plants in low light situations will grow, but it will be a very slow growth. The soil just won't dry out as much, and so they're just more likely to get root rot. They're going to be more susceptible to pests. So if I can, I try and avoid low light situations unless I'm going to be willing to take them outside or get a grow light. The gold standard for plant light is definitely bright filtered light. The general rule of thumb is if a light is not bright enough in a room for you to read during the day and you need to switch a light on, then it's not going to be bright enough for a plant to grow either. I do have plants growing in lower light situations, but being the plant tragic that I am, I do take those plants outside a few times a week to get a good few hours each day of that nice bright filtered light. Alternatively, in some of my very dark rooms, I've actually started dabbling with grow lights, and they are making a massive difference. I've actually got grow lights in both of our bathrooms now, and it has made so much difference to the health of those plants. And actually, if a plant is struggling now, that's going to be where I put them, is underneath those grow lights. The next thing I learned about was water. Did you know that overwatering is the main killer of houseplants? And that was definitely what I was doing to those cactuses. Plants actually need to be watered a lot less than what you think. The general rule of thumb for most of our tropical plants is to let the soil mostly dry out before you water again. So that you can just use something as simple as the finger dip test. So making sure that top layer of soil is actually dry before you re-water. For plants like succulents, I let the soil go completely dry before I re-water. And I'd love to give you a schedule on how often you should water your plants, but it really is more about getting to know your house and your conditions and checking how dry the soil is, because the soil is going to dry out at different rates depending on the time of the year, the humidity, where the plant is situated in your house, how much sunlight it gets. So if you think about photosynthesis, the more sun that it gets, it does that photosynthesis reaction and will actually use more water, whereas a plant that's in a darker location will use less water. As a very general guide, here in southeast Queensland, I water my tropical plants about every week to week and a half in summer, and about every week and a half to 2 weeks in winter, but I really do check that soil before I go re-watering the plant. A few more tips on watering before we move on to the next subject. That is, when you water, make sure you're watering all the way through. So I know some people bottom water. For me, I don't. I just make sure I give the plant a good drink. So I'm watching for that water to be coming out of the drainage holes at the bottom and making sure that plant is getting a good drink all the way through. I also let the plant sit. I often just put it on a tea towel or a paper towel. I let it sit outside for a few hours so that it's fully dried out before I put it back inside, because keeping a plant too damp is the best way to lead to root rot and potentially killing your plant. So I have cover pots on a lot of my plants. Most of my plants are still in nursery pots because they do have those drainage holes at the bottom, and then I just put a cover pot over the top, and it doesn't matter for me if the cover pot has drainage holes or not, but I know that all of the nursery pots have the drainage holes in them. The next thing that I learned about was soil. When I first started planting my plants, I would just grab some soil out of the garden because my plants in the garden were doing well, and then I was wondering why I was bringing the plants inside and they weren't. So definitely do not use garden soil in your indoor plants. And why do I say that? Because garden soil is much heavier and it just doesn't allow for that drainage, and it doesn't allow for that water to get away, and you're basically very good chance of suffocating the roots. Outdoor plant needs are a lot different to indoor plant needs. Use a good quality potting mix, and for me, drainage is just so important. It's something I've really learned about over time. I would not very often these days use just straight potting mix. I always, at a minimum, add something like perlite through the soil, about a 50-50 mix. So you're still getting the nutrients of the soil, but you're helping with that drainage. Most of my plants these days aren't even in soil, surprisingly. I use a mix of cocoa coir. Never quite sure how to pronounce that. I use a mix of fine coconut coir, coarse coconut coir, and perlite, and I find that that works really well for most of my tropical plants. I keep my plants in the soil that they come in from the nursery for about 6 months so that they can acclimatise when I first bring them home. But once they're healthy and they're doing well, I transfer them over to my preferred non-soil potting mix. I also grow a lot of my plants in water, which I actually think looks really nice aesthetically, but it also takes away from that need to water them. So just to recap on those last few points, don't use garden soil on your plants. Make sure you're using a good quality potting mix as a minimum, and hopefully mixing some perlite through as well to help with that drainage. And the other thing that I talked about in there is making sure that all of your pots have drainage holes. So don't, as pretty as pots are, if they don't have drainage holes, use them as a cover pot and put your nursery pot inside. Or actually, I've become really good at stealing my husband's drilling holes in the bottom if you really want to just use those pots that don't have the drainage holes. 2 more to go. The next thing is food. Sugar from photosynthesis from the sun is a plant's main food source, but they do also need the micronutrients that come from fertilizers, and there are so many fertilizers available. You've got both your chemical fertilizers and also your organic fertilizers. At the moment, I'm using the We the Wild brand, but I do chop and change. So my recommendation that I have to you is just to talk to your local nursery, because there's pros and cons for all sorts of fertilizers. As a rule of thumb, I feed in growing seasons, so your warmer months, and back the fertilizer off in the cooler months. But here in southeast Queensland, our plants still grow in winter, so I never stop fertilizing completely. I might just extend the periods in between fertilizing. Also, for my plants that are growing under grow lights, they grow all year round, so I'm fertilizing them all year round. I add the liquid fertilizer to the water probably every 2nd or 3rd water. Some people say do it every water. For me, I find every second is more than enough. And the final thing that I've learned is, unfortunately, pests happen. It doesn't matter how good you are looking after your plants, they happen. My pothos were absolutely decimated by caterpillars in summer this year. They went from these big, amazing plants overnight, literally, to just the stems. It was terrible. So basically what I do is I proactively, as the seasons change, I make sure I do a proactive pest control on all of my plants. And just like the fertilizer, I just talk to my local nurseries and look online. At the moment, I'm using a We the Wild product, but I am always looking for other options as well. So I'm proactively pest controlling, but also whenever I'm doing my regular watering rounds, I'm always checking plants for pests. As I'm moving them around, as I see a yellow leaf and I'm clipping it off, I'm just keeping an eye out for pests and any sign of that. And the other thing is, if I do have a plant that has pests, I will quarantine that from the other plants to avoid it spreading. I used to be terrible at pest control. I'd be, oh, it'll be right. And then inevitably it spread to through the plant and it became so much worse, and it also spread to other plants that the plant was touching. So if you do see pests, or if you do see a plant that's not well, I highly recommend getting on top of it quickly and moving it away from other plants until you get it under control. Learn from my mistakes. Do not try to ignore it. It doesn't work. The problem will just get worse. That's it for me for today. I've got school pickup now, so I better go, but I realize I've got so much more to talk about when it comes to plants. So each of the things that I talked about today, I'll make individual videos where I'll go into much more detail. But I hope that if you're starting out as a plant parent, today was helpful. It was just dipping your toe in the water. It was basically just a data dump of all of the key things that I've learned over the past 3 years. I've got so much more to tell you about plants and I can't wait to share them with you. If you enjoyed this video, please check out some of my other videos. This is a new channel. I'll be making regular videos about once a week on my 2 favorite topics of plants and neurodivergence, and often the link in between. Until my next video, take care.